Today's lesson is entitled Dystopia Revisited. It's Mrs. Bart here, and we're looking specifically at chapters 41 to 44, nearing the end of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This is the equipment you'll need for today's lesson. Can I just ask you as well that if you haven't already watched the YouTube clip of an extract from the film of 1984, that you pause this online tutorial to watch that. If you've done that, you'll see the equipment that you need for today's lesson, and along with the usual, you will need also the 1984 extract that was included in the resources attached to show my homework. Today's learning objectives are to compare the commonalities of dystopic fiction, that's an AO4 objective, and to explore the development of Offred's character, which is of course an AO1 objective. Do go ahead and press pause if you need to grab any of that equipment. With the 1984 extract, it will help to have that printed off, but having it open as a Word document is fine as well. So go ahead and press pause if you need to organise yourself with any of those things, and press play when you're ready to move on. And just a reminder before we move on to turn the notifications on your smartphone off, or better still turn the phone off, put it in another room so that you can avoid distractions and focus on the learning for today. Today's question that we'll be exploring is what are the typical features of modern dystopic fiction in chapters 41 to 44? The do now that I'd like you to tackle is this. Where do we see parallels between the particution of The Handmaid's Tale, found on pages 292 to 295, and the 2-minute hate in the extract from 1984, which was attached to the Show My Homework resources? What are the parallels that you see between those two extracts? If you'd like to take up the challenge, you will need to have a read of what's in the box on the left, and the question is, or the challenge is, to explore how those two extracts, Handmaid's Tale 1984, might be considered examples of classical conditioning as described by psychology. Just a bit of guidance here. We have discussed before this word salvaging, which is a neologism. It's one of the kind of words that Atwood creates for the purpose of her story, means literally saving in anybody's world in the dictionary. Particution is a completely made up word that won't be found in the dictionary, but it's another one of those portmanteau words, and it combines these two words, participation and execution. So you may want to think about that as well. Press pause to have a go at this do now, and press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, on to our plenary. I have said that we're focusing on chapters 41 to 44, but as you do this task, you may feel that you have to range a bit more widely across the text to support this study. So we're back to the original question, what are the typical features of modern dystopic fiction? This is going to be a main body paragraph. Again, that's all I'm asking of you. The standard AO1, AO2 analysis is required with good substantial evidence that's worthy of analysis presented early on to support the beautiful claim, but also constantly referred to throughout the analysis, developing into an AO4 typicality analysis, looking at how dystopic fiction operates, what are the typical features that we see in it. You may want to mention novels like 1984, The Giver, and any others that you've read. Some of the things that you might want to discuss, I've got here in bullet points, that, you know, dystopic fiction is often presented with features of indoctrination, kind of brainwashing people, and rituals and ceremonies. that take place to reinforce the cultural and social values of those societies, surveillance, being watched, the restriction of knowledge and language as well, the notion of punishment for anyone who offends or rebels, and the control of quintessentially human attributes, thought, feeling, and freedom of choice, free will. Again, it's something that you're going to have to think hard about to produce an interesting paragraph that ends in a typicality analysis. I will, as usual, very much enjoy reading them. I always like to hear what you have to say, and your observations, your opinions, even your questions, and I will give you some feedback on these once they are submitted according to the dates and instructions on Show My Homework. Thank you for your focus. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll look forward to reading your analyses. Okay, we're moving into the first part of the lesson, which I've headed up with a quotation from one of the chapters that's set for study this lesson. This quotation, Offred says to the reader, neither of us being her and Nick, says the word love. We know that Offred has talked about love before in the chapters that we studied and in the lessons that we've just looked at. This is in her conversations with the commander, where the commander offers his critique of pre-Gileadian society and what he thinks Gilead offers women. When he asks Offred what her thoughts are on how Gilead might be seen as beneficial to women, she's wary of sharing her opinion, but she does say the word, well, what about love? And of course, in doing that, she is stating to the commander and herself that this universal human pursuit of love, when that's taken out of the equation, then what's really left in humanity? There's 2 tasks that I'd like you to do. Here's the first. Atwood writes, the fact is I no longer want to leave, escape, cross the border to freedom. I want to be here with Nick, where I can get at him. That's found on page 285. What do these sentences tell us about Offred now, and why might this be significant? So you need to comment on Offred's character development. This is clearly an AO1 task. The next task on page 299, the new Offglen speaks. She hanged herself, she says, after the salvaging. She saw the van coming for her. It was better. You're going to need to do some hard thinking, because what I'm asking you here is, what is the it from it was better that Offglen is referring to? I'll need you to pause while you complete these tasks. Take your time, look through the text, and then when you're ready to move on, press play. You will hear from me after you press play, so just make sure you don't give in to the temptation of trying to hear from me before you've had time to do the hard thinking yourself. Okay, well, as we know from recent lessons, but even lessons from ages ago, the one thing that Offred misses, the one thing that she feels makes her human, is this opportunity to express love. Whether that's romantic love, familial love, whatever it is, that's the thing that's been taken away from her and everyone in Gilead, that she misses most, that she feels is her fundamental human right. What's interesting here is that even though it's originally engineered by Serena, Offred takes things further with Nick, and as soon as she begins her affair with Nick, she slips into a very dangerous complacency. What's Atwood up to here? Well, something again that, and this you could develop this into an AO4 comment, but something that dystopic writers often do is to show that even within oppressive regimes like Gilead that seem to come to power and survive unchallenged is that once citizens have time to assimilate, to whatever extent they do, this new society, they often become listless. They often deny or suppress the original feelings of rebellion that they first had. Offred remembers her mother saying that people can grow accustomed to almost anything as long as there are a few compensations. And this affair, this, do you call it relationship, this liaison with Nick, shows that her mum's insights are actually very true. As soon as she is offered the opportunity to have companionship and affection, Offred's guard comes down, really, and she slips into all sorts of complacencies, mentally and actually in some of the things that she does in her behaviour. Obviously, as a handmaid, Offred's situation restricts her horrifically compared to the freedom that her former life allowed. But you see, this relationship with Nick allows her to reclaim the tiniest fragment of her former existence, but the fragment that she values the most. This physical affection, companionship, becomes a good enough compensation that makes the terrible oppressions and restrictions more bearable to her. So much so that Offred seems suddenly a bit worried about the idea of change. She was content to just carry on having these liaisons with Nick. And when Offglen starts to make demands of her, these spying demands of whenever she's called into the commander's office, Offred has trouble processing this in her mind and navigating this in her mind. Nevertheless, within a few pages, we get to the salvaging chapters, and this does kind of shake Offred. This reminds her that, remember, you are in Gilead. And whatever complacency she had starts to fade away. Offglen disappears, and that's really worrying. That's a terrible reminder of how disposable she might be, vulnerable she is. The woman that replaces Offglen, well, she can't work her out at the moment. She seems to be a conformist person, a little bit sinister when she passes on the information that Offglen, the previous Offglen, hanged herself. And it's during this shopping trip, a very ordinary thing in the life of a handmaid, that something climactic happens inside Offred's mind. She remembers that she is living in a horrific totalitarian regime, the realities of which reassert themselves in her mind. And as a reader, we are reminded that we are getting very close, we are rushing towards the novel's conclusion. And however happy Offred might be when she's with Nick, those snatches of happiness are not going, they're going to be short-lived, and they may very well become her undoing. Hold that intention with something that I always tell you is the most important quotation when you're thinking about Offred and the themes of this book. Hold that intention with her statement very early on, I intend to survive. And we see that Offred has got caught up in feelings that she cannot afford in this context. We're now going to have a look. The previous slide that we looked at was AO1, looking at how Offred's character is starting to develop and some of the plot lines are developing. We're now turning our focus to a more AO4 perspective, a typicality analysis. I've subheaded this the manipulation of oppression. As we have seen, dystopic fiction often depicts totalitarian regimes as cleverly manipulative. I would like you to explain at least 2 ways that the particution serves the purposes of Gilead. Atwood uses the setting of Harvard University for the salvaging. So the other thing I'd like you to do is to explain how this real life setting is drawn into fiction and how it's important to the story symbolically. You could argue that that's an AO3. But certainly the previous task, the first task I'm asking you to do is to think about how dystopic fiction presents totalitarian regimes as being cleverly manipulative of human nature. Again, this is going to take some hard thinking. You're going to need to refer to your text to highlight, underline, annotate, and write some notes and some answers to this. Press pause while you do that, and then press play when you're ready to hear from me. Again, trying to avoid the temptation of waiting to hear from me before you gather your own ideas. Okay. The salvaging, we've talked about this word before. Salvaging means saving. It's a really horrific inversion of the meaning, the true meaning of this word. Salvaging in Gilead is ultimately a destruction to its enemies. And this depiction of salvaging by Atwood and the aftermath as well shows Gilead to be a typically cruel, tyrannical, totalitarian regime. This idea of saving could refer to the society at large. Gilead was brought about, if you like, it's predicated on this notion of population growth and population control. Perhaps this idea is that of saving the world by making sure that plenty of babies come into it. Of course, in order to do that, there are some horrific crimes against humanity. You could interpret the word salvaging, saving, as saving society then from the threat posed by offenders, rebels, by executing them, hanging them. There's also this word particution. I mentioned earlier that it's a portmanteau combining the words participation and execution. If you think about that, you see that what Gilead is doing is making sure that the handmaids carry out some of the executions. They participate in it. So they are culpable in some of the more gruesome and violent aspects of the totalitarian regime. And this, of course, is the cleverness in the design of Gilead. They are getting rid of their traitors gruesomely, most of the time by hanging, but the particution means that the handmaids participate in this execution. Just like other regimes that use capital punishment, it's not just punishment for the traitors in the threat of an execution of a gruesome death. It's meant to be a deterrent as well, discouraging other potential rebels who will face the possibility of dying, ironically, at the hands of those that they were trying to help. I mean, another way of explaining the purposes of the persecution for Gilead is that, just like the 2-minute hate in 1984, there is behavioural science behind it. You know, it provides an outlet for the rage and hatred that is building up in the handmaids that they naturally would harbour towards the men who oppress them. What they're doing is harnessing this rage and hatred to suit their own purposes. Notice in the text, even before Aunt Lydia announces the guilty guardian's crime, there is, quote, a murmur of readiness and anger which builds among the handmaids. You know, Offred guiltily admits to having the feelings that she has. She's not proud of them, but she's trying to tell the story truthfully. You know, the handmaids are bursting with frustration and anger at the way that their existence is being repressed, probably at their inability to conceive children, because the handmaids that participate are not pregnant. And Gilead knows, rather smartly, that if these women don't have outlets for these simmering emotions, the pressure cooker of these emotions, then they could face some sort of a sudden rebellion, some sort of upheaval amongst the masses that they're trying to oppress. So by allowing them to participate in the guardian's execution, Gilead is effectively challenging the handmaid's anger onto a single man. He's a scapegoat. The man is presented, we don't even know if this story is true. It might just well be made up to serve the purposes of Gilead. But anyway, the man is presented as a rapist of the handmaids, and while you could easily argue that the commanders are rapists too, this one is not permitted to rape by the laws of Gilead, and he has also caused a miscarriage. So, okay, it's not sanctioned rape, but he has robbed these women of the one thing that gives them value in this society, which is the prospect of carrying a baby to full term. So, as you can see, I know that not all of you have read 1984. You can see that this persecution, just like the 2-minute hate, serves to provide an outlet for the very natural, expected human feelings that come from oppressed groups. We see that even in modern times, how these things spill over in protest marches that can become violent, and feelings simmer and burst out sometimes in these ways. What Gilead and what in 1984 Oceania and the Big Brother party is doing is providing a very controlled and highly manipulated outlet for these. The question about Harvard University, which, as we all know, is an actual place in real life, Atwood kind of draws from this real life setting to add to the story symbolically. I think the actual setting of the persecution is in front of the Widener Library in Harvard Yard. But anyway, Harvard University is one of the best universities in the world. And of course, like all universities, it symbolises the free pursuit of knowledge. So it's interesting that Atwood has chosen it as the location for the salvaging. Here we have the idea of an oppressive regime that's denying access to knowledge, and a persecution, which is the controlled manipulation of punishment and execution by the oppressed themselves, happening in a place where normally in pre-Gilead society people would be free to pursue their own knowledge and the building up of themselves intellectually. In effect, Gilead has turned the world upside down, ironically making a former liberal arts university now the seat of the secret police and a place of ignominious execution.